The Russian Federation is preparing for war in definitive terms. Vladimir Putin, as well as the country's Minister of Defense, have made absolutely historic statements today. In short, there's no discussion of a peace agreement. Not because Russia objects, but because that's the reality. Of course, what this means for the world on a global level is going to be absolutely momentous. It's going to change absolutely everything, and we're going to analyze it in detail. That is, not just the statements themselves, but what they ultimately mean and how they differ from what the West does. There's going to be war for a long time. There's still a lot of war ahead. Despite Western statements, including those from Donald Trump, and the collective West as a whole. They say that this is practically just a couple of days away. We have to wait a little bit for the agreement, but no, the Russian Federation says absolutely the opposite. Let's look at the specific statements and, above all, the implications they have in general terms. Stay until the end of this video, because what you will discover there is precisely what the Russian Federation has ultimately decided and what consequences it will have for the world. All of it? With that said, let's go straight to the statements from Vladimir Putin and the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation. If you had followed me on Telegram, you would already be aware of all this. So I invite you from here to do it as soon as possible, because that's where the latest updates are. We don't post randomly. We select key information, focusing on topics we typically discuss on this channel. So quickly, welcome to Liu Sivaya, or Robo Liu Sivaya, just like the rest of my social networks. Vladimir Putin at the Defense Ministry Board. A very important note about this is that despite Vladimir Putin's statements, which are precisely aimed at congratulating the Ministry of Defense for the work done, it's also important to highlight the settlements that are under control, to speak in terms of what has been achieved and what will be achieved. All of this, yes, is very important on an individual level, but it actually goes much, much further than that. The Russian armed forces liberated over 300 settlements this year. The year 2025 became a very important stage in achieving the objectives of the special military operation. The state will do everything possible to support the families of the fallen soldiers. Here he speaks more behind closed doors. The North Korean fighters provided significant assistance in the liberation of the Kursk region and the subsequent demining of the territory. Here, of course, he speaks for public ears. The capabilities of the Russian armed forces are constantly being developed. Here he opens the door to what we're going to discuss next. Missile systems, drones, and robotics are continuously being delivered to the troops. Is it still pointing in the same direction? The Russian armed forces are wearing down the enemy, including their elite units, because they have received training in Western military centers. In other words, the elite units that have received such training. This training is supposed to be exceptional in centers throughout the collective West, especially in the European Union. They currently cannot match the Russian Federation's armed forces, as shown on the battlefield. Here's a note as a war correspondent. It's not exactly because they are bad soldiers, nor because the training they've received is useless. Sometimes it's useful, other times not. We'd need to review this situation's specifics. It's clear they're now being used as cannon fodder, and it's been one of Ukraine's main problems for a very long time. Fundamental. These statements by Vladimir Putin point to the direction the Russian Federation is taking. In global terms, Russia has the capacity to increase the pace of the offensive in strategically important directions. In the special operation, the Navy component has been reinforced this year with new submarines and 19 surface ships. The submarine Oreshnik will enter combat service before the end of the year. Vladimir Putin, yes, it's true that he has focused quite a bit on specific issues, although he has also undoubtedly spoken about global matters. But the one who has finally revealed to us the question of the moment: what direction will the Russian Federation ultimately take? It has been the country's defense minister, Andriy Volousov, who, as you can see, has made the following announcements, which we will discuss in detail below. The pace of advance of the Eastern, Central, and Western troop groups compared to 2024 has increased by 1.5 to 2 times. The Russian armed forces have maintained strategic initiative throughout the year and have carried out offensives on almost all fronts. The number of settlements liberated in square kilometers of territory this year is one-third higher than last year. The collapse of the Ukrainian defense is inevitable. The threat of invasion in the regions of Belgrade, Kursk, and Bryansk, the Russian regions, has been reduced thanks to the creation of a security zone in the border regions of Ukraine. The liberation of Krasny will allow the security zone in the Kharkov region to be expanded. The liberation of Krasny Liman will open the way to Slavyansk and Konstantinovka, and it will be the key to the Druzhkovka-Kramatorsk-Slavyansk agglomeration. The Ukrainian military are securely blocked in Dmitrov, formerly Mirnograd. The Ukrainian army is now doing little good. In particular, the head of the armed forces of Ukraine, Mr. Shursky, actually made the opposite announcement, saying that Ukraine controls practically the entire settlement of Pokrovsk. Well, now the city of Krasnoyarsk, which was liberated, I remind you, by the Russian Federation, is still under Volossov. The Dnieper troop group is fighting on the outskirts of the city of Aryeha in the Zaporozhye region. Aryeha. We are going to see exactly what the situation is in Ulaypola. And we are going to see why he is saying this. The Dnieper troop group is holding the island area of the Dnieper and repelling enemy landing attempts on the peninsulas. Will there be Kimbo in August 2025? There was a change in the use of drones, and currently, the Russian armed forces outnumber the Ukrainian armed forces 2-1 in the number of drones. The key task for next year is to maintain and increase the pace of progress achieved. Now, having reviewed the main statements, what we can highlight from them in particular, let's move directly to the general. And it's because, why do you think I tell you that the Russian Federation is really standing its ground? And really, well, it doesn't declare war, but rather prepares for a really long war. And in fact, the key here is that Russia, let's say, is turning the tables. I mean, where before it was often talking about diplomacy, trying in some way to make its voice heard regarding the Minsk agreements. That is, before this particular conflict began, Vladimir Putin was constantly talking about it. However, now it's understood that if it can't be done diplomatically, it will be done militarily. I have the key points here. There will be war for a long time. It changes absolutely everything in the sense that what has just been announced between Vladimir Putin and Mr. Belousov is, in fact, a structural plan that involves a change not so much in doctrine, but within the organization of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. That is to say, this year, it didn't really sound like an annual departmental report, but rather like a doctrinal document in times of war. That's how both the president of the country and the minister of defense have expressed themselves, as if foreshadowing what's coming next. In public statements, basically, it was said that Russia is turning the war into a long-term management regime with a very clear logic that includes a set of objectives. In addition, an architecture of resources and institutional mechanisms that ultimately are meant to make the current military campaign sustainable for years, and not just until, for example, next spring or the following winter. That is the Russian Federation. I understand that she's doing this just in case, but what she's really done is restate that she was already doing it, she had been doing it, but now she's made it official to rethink the entire organization of all the institutional pieces regarding what's coming, and to do it, moreover, in a way in which the country is already absolutely prepared to face long periods of combat. The line about progress in the dialogue with the new United States administration is not ruled out, of course, but there's also no talk of diplomacy in the usual sense. Rather, it is an attempt to break the unity of the Western coalition and therefore make the conflict more costly for the collective West. The real mass, however, is in the war not as a single front, but as a framework for resource management. And I want that to be absolutely clear to you. That is Bill Assa, who is an economist in his own right, unique in his field, but in his beginnings and, let's say, in his basic content. He is a person dedicated to economics, someone who came to bring order to the Ministry of Defense and to unite finance, industry, logistics, repair, and human capital. That is, before we were talking about the Ministry of Defense as a military organization, now this changes completely. And he is an expert on democracy, on the topic of democracy, and he is an expert in democracy. And an expert in democracy, and an expert on the topic of democracy, and an expert in democracy and democracy. Democracy and an expert in democracy, and an expert on the topic of democracy, and the topic of democracy, and he is an expert on the topic of democracy. But the one who ends up winning on the battlefield will be the one who can have reproduction, mass production, as the basis of their military model, and their model, I could even say military economic, therefore deliver quickly, produce in mass. And this is something that becomes the main motto for the Russian Federation and the key to their tactics and strategy. And here's another absolutely fundamental point. The Russian Federation has now understood the new model of war. Let's just say, not by chance. Many analysts talk about the fact that Russia, unlike Ukraine, and of course, unlike Latin America, the collective West has managed to adapt very, very well to the current times and has understood very well what modern warfare means. Modern warfare, in short, in a very brief summary, is about drones. So it's everything related to drones, electronic warfare of all kinds, and also protection against them. It is necessarily an air defense that can constantly improve, and it is a constant need. Improve all means, improve all tactics and strategies of the army to preserve the lives of soldiers as much as possible in these extremely complex circumstances. That is the Russian Federation. What is changing is its entire model, adapting it more and more. And now it has officially announced it to what are the foundations of modern warfare. And here, what's peculiar is that Belousov is trying to adapt the Russian army so that the soldiers' successes on the battlefield are not simply a matter of chance, but rather the result of perfect alignment between supply, application, and repair. In other words, he tries to systematize absolutely everything. The approach of an economist here is very clear. What is being announced is a state armament program for the years, pay attention, 2027 to 2036. So notice to what extent they are talking, on one hand, about long-term modernization, and on the other hand, they're saying that this war is really going to last for a while. And here, electronics, unmanned systems, robotics, space assets, as well as strategic forces, everything is going to be addressed with special emphasis on air defense, anti-missile systems, and all kinds of communication means. These control systems, communication equipment, and also electronic warfare. But at the same time, you understand this is something that might surprise more than one person. Massive investments in things that might seem so basic, like, for example, motorcycles. And the thing is, in particular, Belousov understands that this new war, this Model 2 or almost 3.0 of 21st century warfare, it needs and requires action, trying to do it as quickly as possible so that both mobility and mobilization are as fast as possible, so that Russian army soldiers can practically carry out both an evacuation, if necessary, and an attack operation almost instantly. This, for example, is very difficult without motorcycles, and now assault units are using them more and more. And everything is being prepared so that this, in fact, is used more and more. That is, the Russian Federation has understood the rules of the game, and this is becoming more and more obvious. Also, with the issue between the United States and Venezuela, the law of the strongest hasn't gone anywhere. The international community is left stunned while the United States decides to block a supposedly sovereign country. It is left stunned in some cases, but however, it imposes sanctions in other cases. They agree when it suits them, but when it doesn't, they're always left stunned by the United States. Because what works, I repeat, is the law of the strongest. That is to say, Russia, quite obviously, has to commit to growing its production, to constantly growing and improving its military industrial complex. And in this sense, what it needs to do is to officially establish a new management model that encompasses absolutely everything. Even the contracts within the Ministry of Defense are going to change. I mean, from now on, they will have different cycles. From now on, they will be reviewed differently. In other words, an economist in charge has indeed decided to bring order to absolutely everything. The most innovative part of the report is not, in fact, the strategic missiles nor new systems, but rather the transformation of tactics. In the very war economy that she has been describing in the United States of America, drones, in her interpretation, are not just an auxiliary means, but have become a massive attack force. The enemy builds a line of drones as a kind of total destruction zone at a depth of about 10 to 15 kilometers. The response from the Russian Federation should include accelerating the movement of units. What I was telling you earlier, the saturation of electronic warfare, that is the saturation of the front through electronic warfare, the transition to models and operating schemes for the units, much more mobile, much faster, both in terms of delivery and in terms of evacuation. Therefore, it's not at all a coincidence that in this report, things that seem so apparently incompatible are put together. For example, the creation of unmanned systems units. Now drones are always on the agenda. The training of tens of thousands of specialists, the supply of warfare equipment, and trench electronics. That is, so they can be practically with every soldier. And at the same time, the massive purchase of motorcycles, ATVs, and buggies. That is, everything that might seem absolutely mundane has to occupy the minds of the Ministry of Defense. And from now on, nothing is as it apparently seems. Because of the creation of manned units, starting from this report, apparently incompatible things are put together, as they are. For example, the creation of units of